All right. This is Beth Billings from Around the Table Yarns, and I am here to host our first meeting of Sweater Club. And Sweater Club is part of our year-long Project Monday series. We will be doing Sweater Club once a month from now until the end of 2023. During those 12 meetings, we're going to work on 2 separate pullover sweaters. The first one is a pattern by Anka Strick called the Naima pullover. So it looks like this. And the pattern is about $8. It's actually charged in euros, but the pattern is about $8. Because it is a paid pattern, I will not be doing detailed screenshots of the pattern because that would be not in the best interest of our designer. We do ask that you not share patterns between yourselves, that you each buy a copy of the pattern from the designer, from Ravelry or from us, however you want to do it. So that's part of our requirements. We are hoping that everybody who participates in Sweater Club is already a knitter, already knows how to cast on, to knit, to purl, and to bind off. Increasing and decreasing are a bonus. If you can do those things, I love it. If you can't, that can certainly be covered in the course of this class. It is a free class, no registration is required, and there's no payment for the class. But if you have not already purchased your yarn, if it's not something you already have in your stash, we'd love it if you would get it from us. And if you don't have the pattern already and you need it, you can also purchase it through us. And any materials like needles or stitch markers that you have, if you don't have them already, same goes. So today, we're breaking this up into 6 sessions for the Naima pullover, and then we'll be doing another pattern called the Wren pullover, which is actually done in 3 different weights of yarn. So I'm really excited about that. The reason I picked these 2 is because the Naima pullover is a top down in the round pattern. It has short row shaping to shape the back of the neck, and it works all of the pieces in the round, which is a great skill set to have. And it means that at the end of it, we will not have to seam the sweater together. However, many sweaters are written from the bottom up, and many sweaters are seamed together. So our second pattern will be a little bit simpler, and we will focus more on the finishing work for that sweater. So that is the Wren pullover, and that's the second half of the year. So we've spaced it out for each class. We're going to talk about size and gauge and the pattern itself today. And then next time, which is in February, we'll be talking about casting on, doing the twisted rib, and getting through the first part of the collar. So we're going to take this in nice, easy steps. It is not my intention to frustrate anybody by not going fast enough. Many of you are already knitters or crocheters who have other things to do. So when you get done with your homework for this club for the month, put it aside and work on something else, because we really want to work through each of these steps together to get the most benefit from them. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the nice way that she laid out this pattern on the front of the page. So let me just, let me just turn on my document camera here. So I'm not at all sure what that's showing. So the Naima pullover, the front page of it looks like this. And the name of the designer is Anka Strick, which is her Ravelry name. I know she has a different name, but I'm not sure what it is. And she wrote it in 9 sizes. The first size is 36 inches around, and the 9th size is 66 inches around. So it is a very size inclusive sweater. She wrote it for DK weight, and that's the weight that we are doing for the club. And the reason I chose that weight and not the worsted is that DK is a little bit more economical to purchase because you get more yards per skein. And so it's not as many skeins often to make a whole sweater. I do have somebody who's using the worsted pullover pattern in the morning class that meets in the store. I have no objection to that. And if you prefer a different pattern altogether that works top down, that's okay too. We're not married to this pattern, but this is the one that we're going to be referencing throughout, and the one that I'm looking at as I plan each class. Anka Strick also put down the size of the needles, right? And I just sort of love how she's got this little fill in the gap thing at the bottom. She's given all of the information that she used, and then she's allowed you to write in your own. And I think that that is a really helpful thing, especially for a group like this, where we want to be able to reference back to these pieces of information. So this assumes that we do a gauge swatch, because she wants us to take our yarn and take our needles and come up with our own gauge. And she also wants us to choose a size. So we're going to go over that information first. And I'm going to take that off of the camera. So I hope you have your pattern at home to follow along with. I'm looking at page 2, and I'm going to put my gauge swatches here. I'm looking at page 2 of the pattern, and the first thing that anybody has to decide when they're making a sweater is, how will it fit me? And so the sizes that are given in numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and they reference a bust measurement. So how does that relate to you as a body, as a person wearing the sweater? The bust measurement is often, for a woman's sweater, the greatest measurement, but it isn't always. So when we look, I'm going to just bring this in here and get a pencil. When we look at a person's torso, the bust measurement, so the measurement usually around below the armpits, is where the bust measurement is taken. And that is usually the biggest, because of our chests, that is usually the biggest measurement that we're going to take. But not all of us are created equal, and not all of us have the same size everywhere. So sometimes the hips are a greater measurement. And the nice thing about this pattern is that it's written with 3 different body shapes. The first one is straight up and down. The second one is A-line, meaning that it gets wider as we go down. And the third one is a balloon shape that goes out and back in. I think the out and back in is probably the best for slender people. I think that's probably not a shape that suits everybody. I think the straight up and down can be a shape that is very forgiving for many people. But if your hips or butt are a little bit on the bigger side, the A-line can be a very flattering shape. So those are the 3 shapes that the sweater comes in. And so one of the decisions we'll be making is which shape we're going to do our sweater in. So again, looking at sweaters and thinking about how they fit, this is the measurement that most people tell you to take. And that's certainly what she tells you in the pattern, is to take your bust measurement and use that to decide which size to make. I don't always agree with that, especially if you're going to make something A-line. Sometimes people's shoulders are much more slender than their bust or their hip measurements. And so sometimes it is not the worst thing in the world to do a smaller on top and then reach a larger size as you get to the bust or as you get to the hip measurements. And again, that's why I think the A-line can be a very good option for many people. So what I'd like it if you could do is find a sweater or a sweatshirt or a t-shirt that fits you the way you want this sweater to fit you. So looking at the picture again, it is meant to be an oversized sweatshirt fitting kind of a sweater. This is not a tight sweater. So when we talk about the way that this fits, we talk about it having positive ease. So something's ease is the comparison of the garment measurement to the actual body that's underneath it. And 0 ease means if you're 40 inches around, that the sweater is exactly 40 inches around. Negative ease means that you sort of have to slither into the sweater and it's a little bit more on the slinky side. A bathing suit is a good example of something that has negative ease. But this sweater, which is clearly bigger than the model wearing it, has positive ease. And how much positive ease is really up to the wearer. In the pattern itself, we're given a choice between 4 and 12, almost 12 inches of positive ease. So on top of the measurement of the biggest part around you, you're adding between 4 and 12 extra inches. And that's to make it loose and comfortable like a sweatshirt. So my recommendation is for you to take a sweater that you like the fit of and lay it flat and measure across from armpit to armpit, straight across from armpit to armpit. So for example, my around measurement is around 45 total. So that would be 22.5 across. And the measurement of a sweater that I like is 25. So my sweater that I like the fit of is 50 inches around. And it gives me 5 inches of positive ease. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'd like everybody to find a sweater or a top that they like the fit of and use that specifically for this measurement. But if you find that your hip measurement is different significantly from your bust measurement, you should record which one is greater. If it is your hip measurement, you definitely should be thinking about doing the A-line. Okay, because then it will comfortably cover all of you and not be tight at the waist. All right. So we're going to measure a sweater. That's our first assignment, is to measure a sweater that fits us well around the bust and around any other part that's bigger. The second assignment is to decide which size of the ones that she gives us are suitable for our measurements. So like I said, and I'm going to show the size information here because I don't think that's too much of a trade secret. So for this project, it's a European pattern. Ooh, I'm trying to get rid of the shadow. It might be too bright. It's a European pattern, so it gives the first set of measurements in centimeters, and the second set of measurements are in inches. And so I looked and I saw that this measurement here, 50.75, is the closest to how I would like my sweater to fit. So I am choosing the 5th size. Now, the difference between this one and the next size up is about 4 inches. So you're not going to find something that is exact necessarily unless you exactly want it to be 46.75 or 62.5 or one of these numbers. But you want to be in the ballpark, and they give you the suggestion here of which direction in the ballpark you might want to go. If you want it to be closer fitting, you only want to add 4 inches of positive ease. If you want it looser fitting, you could go up to 11.75 inches of positive ease. So what does that mean exactly? Well, let's say you're 32 inches around. You would want to do the 36 if you only want 4 inches of positive ease. But you could do the 39. And that would still be in the ballpark. So it depends on how you want your garment to fit, which of these sizes you pick. Okay. She recommends down here that you pick your measurement of, you use your measurement of your full bust and then add your desired ease and pick the size that closest fits that. So I did mine here. I did 45 inches plus 4 equals 49. That's closest to the size 5. And then, as we said before, she got a gauge of 20 stitches and 28 rows or rounds to 10 by 10 centimeters, which is 4 by 4 inches. In stockinette on the main needle, so the larger of the two needles after blocking. So I want to talk a little bit about finding gauge. I cast on, I was like, I read the label for my yarn, and it said that I would get gauge with a size 7 needle. And so I cast on, which way can I go? I have to lift up, sorry. I cast on the 20 stitches on my size 7 needle. I purled 1 row, and then in the first knit row, I knit 1, and then I knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, 7 times to indicate that I was using a size 7 needle. So if you want to keep track of your gauge swatch, this can be a helpful way to do it. And then I proceeded to continue in stockinette. So I'd knit a row, purl a row until it was about 4 inches long. And then I bound off and I put this swatch in a bowl of water, and I pushed it down in the bowl of water, and I squeezed all of the bubbles out of it, all of the air, and I put it back in the water, and I just made sure that there was no air left in it, that it was not floating anymore. And then I poured the water out, and I gently squeezed all of the fluid out that I could. I actually wrapped it in a towel and did the squeezing while it was in a towel. And then I laid it completely flat. And I conveniently have radiators in my house, so I laid it completely flat on a radiator and untwizzled the edges, so the edges were not rolled under. And I let it dry flat. And I was perfectly content that this was going to be, it was 4 inches when I finished knitting it. And I was perfectly content that this was going to be perfect. And then I measured it, and it was 4.5 inches wide. And this is me telling you that I have been knitting for 30-something years. And I know that I'm always on gauge and I never have to check. But look at that. It's 4.5 inches wide. Can you see that? It's very glary right there. So it's 4.5 inches wide. That is not gauge. If that were gauge, it would be 4 inches wide. Really doesn't like my overhead light. So that is right at 4.5 inches. So I did what everybody else does, and I thought, I blocked my swatch, man. It's done. I don't need to do anything else. I'm going to do math, and I'm going to make this gauge work for my sweater. And then I had somebody come into the store, and I helped them, and I told them that maybe they should try the needles and the gauge that the pattern called for before they decided that their too big or too small swatch was the right one. And so then I thought I should probably do another swatch. So I took the swatch and I set it aside, and I used the next size down, which is the size that she recommends. and I cast on 20 stitches, and I went through all of the same steps, this time with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eyelets. And my cat broke the yarn, so I didn't go quite as far up, and I blocked it. And it's perfect. It's exactly the gauge I wanted. And I like it, it's fine. But I would have left it, and I would have done cartwheels to try and make, and back bends to make it work with the other gauge, because I didn't feel like doing a second swatch. So this is the long way of me saying, I know that swatching is boring. I know as well as everybody else that swatching is no fun, but it is really important. And the real proof of this was something that came in my email today from Arnold Culliford, Jen Arnold Culliford, who is a knitting teacher. And she said she has a blog, and her blog this morning was essentially this question. So she has this beautiful yarn. It doesn't look quite as beautiful in this picture as it does. It doesn't translate as well, but it's this beautiful turquoise yarn, and it has a neon pink and yellow like splodge that comes out as little dashes of color. And she was doing a pattern called the Wearing Jumper, which is a Ravelry pattern with, oh, that's very pale. It's a turtleneck, and it has some nice shaping, and she really talks up this beautiful jumper and how excited she was to make this jumper, which is a DK weight, out of the yarn that she bought, which is also a DK weight. But she gets done with it, and the whole time she's knitting it, it just doesn't feel right. She gets gauge, but the whole time she's knitting with it, it just feels too loose. And I'm sure you all know what I mean when you're knitting something and it just feels too loose. And so she finishes the sweater, and she's blocking it and waiting for it to dry, and she doesn't like it. And she's looking at it, and she's planning never to wear it. And she says to us in the blog that she had 3 options. She could gift the garment to someone else. She could frog it and reknit it at a tighter gauge and perhaps a bigger size. Or she could throw it in the tumble dryer and see whether it would felt enough that she could wear it. So she ruled out option number 1. She thought if she didn't like it well enough, nobody would. So she couldn't give it to anybody. And she'd put 50 hours of knitting, as well as the expense of the yarn, into it already. She didn't want to frog it and reknit it. So she tried option number 3, and she lucked out. And here's her wearing her very cute pullover sweater. And she says she was delighted that her gamble paid off. But she risked the price of her yarn and 50 hours of knitting. And she asks the question at the end of this blog post, was that worth it? So before we get there to 50 hours, let us take extra time. She said if she had used a larger gauge swatch, she would have seen the looseness of the fabric. And she should have done a bigger gauge swatch. The second thing she said is that looking at the fabric the whole time she was knitting it, she didn't like it. I don't know if you've ever knitted something that you didn't like the whole time you were knitting it, but listen to your brain. If you don't like it at the beginning or the middle or the end, a miracle's not going to happen. So let's make sure that we swatch. Let's make sure that we try out our yarn and that we do block it. In other words, we do get it saturated wet and let it dry completely. My yarn is Eco Cashmere from Blue Sky Fibers. I was lucky enough to get this before it was discontinued. And I love this yarn, but like many very soft, fine fibers, to spin it, they spin it with oil. And the oil is saturated into the fiber. And until it's washed, you don't actually know what the yarn is going to do. So it's really important with fibers like cashmere or silk to make sure that you block it thoroughly. And if it's a yarn you're using that you've never used before, if it's a plant fiber versus a wool fiber versus any other animal fiber, it's really important to block those swatches and make sure, because I actually expected this one to be 4 inches. It looked like 4 inches when it came off my needles. And it wasn't until it was completely laid flat and dried that it became clear that it was 4.5 inches. Are you all convinced?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do your rows match the number of rows?
I don't know. You know what? I almost never check my row gauge.
Okay. Okay. That's what my question was.
My row gauge is, it's not, what I have found over the years is that my row gauge does not necessarily match the row gauge of the designer. And I am not concerned about that unless I am knitting something side to side,
Okay.
because I'm mostly concerned with widths.
Okay.
Length I can adjust by knitting longer or shorter. But width I cannot fix by, I can fix by making more or fewer stitches, but the row gauge, I'm more willing to sort of take that as it comes. And many pattern writers do not specify the number of rows, they just specify the number of inches to get between moments of shaping.
Beth, wouldn't
Yes.
you though, like I was taught to measure my swatch before and after washing it,
Mhm.
so that if my row gauge is going to change substantially, I need to knit to my gauge, not to the length that it measures as I'm knitting it.
So I would agree with that, particularly with silks, finer fabrics like cashmere, rayons, bamboo, some cottons. I would be more like denim. I would be more concerned with things that have a history of not being as stable. But if you're knitting with a pure wool, especially if you're knitting with a non-superwash wool, it's less likely that that will be as big of an issue. So it's a great suggestion. Is that Laura?
No, it's Julie.
Julie. Hello.
Yeah. Hi.
So that's a great suggestion. So if you're not familiar with the yarn, if the yarn has anything in it that is not just pure wool, and you haven't worked with it before, then checking the row gauge can be very helpful information. The time that it really bit me in the butt was when I used a wool and silk fingering blend, and it grew a lot after blocking. And the yarn manufacturer actually said on a pattern book that they wrote for the yarn, please, block all your swatches because this yarn grows. But amazingly, they didn't put that information on the balls of yarn itself. They just saved it for the pattern. And
I've used some natural fibers that they plump up, and so they get wider. The stitch count gets bigger, but the row gauge gets shorter as the yarn kind of plumps up. And so
after blocking, you've seen significant changes?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I always measure my swatch before and after I wash it.
That is not wasted advice at all. I did not measure my row gauge because, again, I'm mostly interested in matching inches or matching measurements, and I'm not as worried about the rows. There is some raglan shaping in this, so that could come back and punish me. Because the raglan shaping could have, if my row gauge is significantly off, the raglan shaping could be affected. However, for most patterns, the row gauge is less important in the shaping of the pattern overall. So unless you're knitting from side to side, from like cuff to cuff, the row gauge can usually be adapted for within the pattern. But if there's a significant difference between your row gauge before and after blocking, you may find that you need more or less of the yarn. Any other questions? Okay. So you may notice that I only did 20 stitches. And I knitted this, you know, I could count. I knitted this until it was 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 2, 4, 6. Oh, looks like I did 28. So on a size 7, I got 4 inches with 28 rows. And then I cut this one short because the yarn got broken. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 2, 4, 6, 7. So it is considerably shorter, and one more row wouldn't make it 4 inches. So I think you can measure it before and after, but you can definitely measure it after and know what the blocked row gauge is. Okay. So the yarn that was suggested for this pattern, we used to carry in the store, and we don't currently carry it. And it was, I wish this was not so bright. 1 second, I'm going to just lower the light in my room. So the Fiber Company Lore is a DK weight yarn that has about 275 yards per skein. And just to focus. Sorry, I'd like the words not to be not in focus. It has 275 yards per skein. It is a lamb's wool from the Romney sheep. It is kind of loose and springy, and it is the most similar to Kelburn Woolen's Scout of all of the yarns in our store. They both have the same yardage. They're both made from non-superwash wool, and we actually got Lore originally to go with Scout. But what we found was that it was very much more traditional itchy wool and not so soft, even though it was a lamb's wool, and it's not the itchiest wool out there, but we found that it was not so comfy against the skin, and people did not pick it over the Scout. But if you're familiar with Kelburn Woolen's Scout, or if you're familiar with Fiber Company Lore, that is the yarn that Inkastrick is recommending or started with for this project. Any DK weight can do, but again, you may not like how any DK weight comes out. We have somebody in the morning class who's doing this with Andorra by Kelburn Woolens, which is more or less a sport weight. In other words, it's a little bit thinner. It normally knits to more like 5 1/4 or 5 1/2 stitches per inch. And so she actually did her gauge swatch and kept changing needles. And we, at the time, I thought it was okay for her to change needles without doing the full 4 inches. But what we found is that she did, she did one on the size 6 needle, and then she did the next one. Then she like only did about 2 inches. And then she went up to a size 7 needle, and then she went up again to a size 8, about this far up. And so there's only a little bit of the size 6 needle, and then not quite 4 inches of the size 7 needle. And then she was continuing with the size 8 needle. And what we decided is that she should frog the whole thing and do each square fully. I mean, they can be attached, but she should do 4 inches of each, because by the time she got to the size 8, she actually liked the tension in the denser size 6 needle swatch. And she said, can I use it at that tension? And yes, of course she can, but we'll have to do math. We'll have to figure out which of the sizes will correspond for her to that tension. So that's another reason to swatch, because you may not like a gauge of 5 stitches to the inch in your yarn. You might like a gauge of 6 stitches to the inch or 4 stitches to the inch. And it's worthwhile finding out if at 5 stitches to the inch, you're not happy. So your first assignment was to measure your bust and measure your sweater. Your second assignment is to knit a gauge swatch or swatches until you're satisfied, and to block them. And as Laura said, or as Julie said, you can measure them before and after and see if they significantly change. So again, she's quite right. If a yarn plumps up, it can shrink a little bit sideways. It can sort of plump up and shrink a little bit this way. And some things can stretch and grow. Many of the plant fibers and silk and rayon can stretch and grow. So it is worthwhile to know if that's something that is a characteristic of your yarn. So we've got 2 assignments so far. The last one is that this pattern, I'm just going to show one paragraph. And it's right here. And it's the place eyelet markers. So it's the setup round for placing eyelet markers. This is 1 round. Okay. And it says knit 1 TBL, purl 1, knit 1 TBL for 14, 14, 14, 14, 14, 16, 16, 16, 18 stitches. Place marker. Purl 1, knit 1 TBL, purl 1 for 36, 36, 36, 36, 36, 36, 36, 36, 36, 38, 38 stitches. So a lot of this paragraph is the repeat of all of the sizes, all 9 sizes. You only want one of the numbers in this bracket system. So there's 9 numbers, you only want your number. So go ahead with a highlighter or a pencil on a paper copy of, or if you use one of the, I know people who scan it and then mark up their copies in some note-taking software, or if you use, what's it? The pattern. I can't think of it.
Knit Companion.
Knit Companion. You can make notes on your, you can highlight or make notes on your pattern in Knit Companion if you use a tablet or a phone to follow your, but whatever you do, I do want you to identify your pattern, your size that you choose, and go through. If you are not sure, Once you've done your gauge swatch and measured your sweater, if you're not sure what size to do, please call me or come into the store. I would be happy to talk through it with you. Sometimes there's a little math. But this is just to show that it can be a really dense, long paragraph, but mostly it's for this one number that we're looking. And that would shorten it considerably if it was just written out for my size. So one recommendation that I have made to people is if this feels onerous and confusing, go ahead and write it out so that you're very clear what you're doing in this row. If you do that once or twice, you probably won't need to do it for every single one, because it will give you a good sense of what's going on. So that's the third assignment for between now and next time, is to go through the pattern and identify your size in all of the instructions, not just in this one, but all of them for all of the pages. And then also, if you're choosing the A-line shape, the balloon shape, or the straight body shape, you want to identify where all of that happens. Okay, so those are the steps we're going to take for next time. And I just want to talk a little bit about there I am. I just want to talk a little bit about the pattern, the sweater construction, to just get you ready for the next time we meet. So, I'm going to remove the spotlight. Hello, everybody. Wow, more of you came. The sweater is constructed from the top down, so it's from the neck down, and it has a cast on of however many stitches, and then she does a seamless join, which means that for this sweater, she's casting on one extra stitch. So the cast on number is one extra stitch, so that you can work the last stitch and the first stitch together to make a seamless join. So please note, if you choose to go ahead and start, that is the case. So it tells you to cast on this many stitches, and then you work the seamless join, and then you'll have one less when you're ready to start your collar. The collar is worked in a twisted rib, and there is a line, you can't see it in this picture so well, but there's a line of eyelet stitches that starts in the collar and comes all the way down. So the extra supplies that you need for the beginning of your sweater, right at the beginning, you need a smaller than 24-inch needle in the collar size and in the sweater size. So if you're doing the sweater in a 6 and the ribbing in a 4, you need the 4 and the 6 in a less than 24-inch circumference. Okay, whether you make that with interchangeables or you have a 16-inch fixed, you need a smaller than 24-inch circumference for the top of the sweater. The other thing is that you need markers in the collar. So right off the bat, you're going to need a beginning of round marker. You're going to need 4 markers for the eyelets. And then as soon as the collar is finished, you're going to need 4 more markers for the raglan. The raglan is only at the top of the sweater from the shoulder down to the underarm, but the eyelets continue all the way to the bottom. So they will be simultaneous, and then just the raglan, then just the eyelets to the bottom. You can choose to omit them, but if you don't choose to omit them, you should have a different color marker for the raglan and the eyelets. So, for example, pink for the raglan, green for the eyelets, and blue for the beginning of the round. So that as you come to each one, you know what you're supposed to do with that piece. There is short row shaping. So when we start next week or next month, we're going to do the cast on, and we'll talk about the German twisted cast on, which is a nice stretchy cast on that's attractive at the top. We can also talk about doing a tubular cast on. So if you're interested in either one of those, let me know. But we can do one or the other of those for a nice stretchy top of the sweater. And then you're going to work the collar in a twisted rib with the eyelets in place. And then we're going to switch to the main needles, and that's next month. So it's just the collar next month. When we meet again, we're going to start working the short rows. So you'll be tempted to go on, but I'd really like it if we do the short rows together. So unless you're a short row pro, stick with me. And then after that, we'll be working down to the arm separation and putting on holders the sleeves while we finish the body, and then picking up and finishing the sleeves, and then doing finishing work all together. So that's sort of an overview of everything that we're planning to do with the sweater. Does anybody have any questions? Hi, Julie.
Hi. Sorry, I'm really sick, so I sound awful. But
I'm sorry.
Is there a schematic with the pattern, or like you said, there's an A-line option?
Yes.
Okay. Does it tell how much wider it gets at the hips if you do the A-line, or is it customizable?
It's customizable. It just gives you the measurements, but I want to point out that this is the schematic, and it doesn't show the short rows at the top with the back of the neck being higher than the front of the neck, and it only shows the straight sides.
Okay.
So as we get, I haven't looked deeply at the differences between the balloon and the A-line and the straight sides, but I will before next time.
Okay. I
So
just
we-
wondered, like, if you're choosing, you'd kind of want to know what those differences in measurements are going to be.
Yes.
But you could probably tell it by the stitch count in the gauge, right? If
Yes.
you
You
okay.
should be able to, so the expected gauge is 5 stitches to the inch. So if you divide any of the stitch counts on the pattern, particularly in that section that's under the arms, which is very straightforward because that's the body. So you're not messing around with shoulder shaping or separating the sleeves. It's just the body part that's being worked. So it should be pretty straightforward to figure out how wide that's going to be at the top and the bottom and the middle.
Okay. And is there an option for shorter sleeves?
There's always an option for shorter sleeves, especially when you work sleeves down from the shoulder, which is this, in this case, we will be working the sleeves down from the shoulder. I personally do not want a long sleeve.
Right.
I push this is one of my favorite sweaters. It ends at my elbow. I love it.
Yeah.
So if you don't like a long sleeve, you don't have to knit 1 inch past where you want to go.
Okay.
And, you know, some sweaters are really cute with short sleeves.
Well, and the nice thing with top down is you can try it on as you go. So you can figure it out as you go.
That is the nice thing. So the pro, I really weighed whether or not we should start with the top down or the bottom up. And the pro is that we don't have to sew seams in the first sweater that we do, which I think is super helpful. And the con is that gauge is something that is really important to check while you're knitting the sweater. And checking gauge in a yoke that's increasing is not the best place. So you can try it on and see if it fits well. And I do recommend that we do this. So in addition to the markers and the 2 different sizes of needles for the collar, and then you want a bigger needle in the main for the body, you are going to want something to put your stitches on so that you can try them on. In the shop, many of our customers like the barber cords, but they are essentially the same thing as a piece of smooth cotton yarn. Oh, look at Julie's got hers. They're pink. Barber cords are a silicone cord that it's a hollow tube, and you put it on the tip of your needle. And I can demonstrate this when we get to it, but you can slide all your stitches onto it, and it's very smooth for that purpose, especially in something like a DK weight. It can be a little fiddly in fingering weights, but it's really easy in the DK weight and sometimes in the worst, like the bigger yarns. So the barber cords come in 60-inch lengths, and so they can hold most of the stitches, if not all. And that can be really helpful for trying things on. In the absence of a barber cord, a piece of smooth cotton and a darning needle will work. And that's what we used to use. So don't feel like you have to have that. It's a nice option, but it's not the only way to get. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Just want to make sure I've covered everything between now and next time. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't have a question, but if you like me to show the detail you were explaining in the collar, I can.
Oh, please do. Did you already cast on?
Mm-hmm.
You fancy person. Isn't that fun? What yarn are you using?
Scrumptious.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. So that's on 4 like corners of the collar, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's
like
front
back,
left and right, and back left and right. And then it runs diagonally down the sweater.
Yep.
Yeah. So do you have some good suggestions for yarns that you have in the shop that would work?
Yes. So Kim is using Scrumptious, which is a recycled acrylic product. And we also have Color Crafter. Both of those are very affordable, very soft, and lots of colors. They're $4 for the Color Crafter and $4.25 a skein for the Scrumptious, and they are like 300 yards each. So you don't need a ton to be able to do this. On the wall, so that's over by where the classroom used to be, on the wall, starting from left to right, I really think Mojave could work nicely for this, but it's a little bit on the thin side, so it might be nice to double it. Soft Fun should work perfectly, which is a cotton acrylic blend. Arroyo should work perfectly, and we're getting a big shipment of Arroyo in, I hope tomorrow, a big restock. And Dos Tierras, Scout, which I mentioned earlier. Scout is nice because it's got 275 yards per skein, and we carry all of the colors. Arroyo, we don't carry all of the colors, but like I said, we should be processing a shipment of that tomorrow. So if any of you haven't bought your yarn and you would like to look at Arroyo, let us know, because we'll get that up as quickly as possible in the next couple of days.
I think Arroyo is a good one too, because it has 335 yards per skein.
Mm-hmm. So it is a very nice yarn, and it's pretty. So we
is
did
that Malabrigo? Who makes that? Is that a Malabrigo?
Malabrigo.
Yarn? Okay.
So Kelburn Woolen, Scout, Malabrigo, Arroyo. We do have somebody using Kelburn Woolen's Andorra, which has a little bit of mohair in it. So it's a Highland wool and mohair blend. That is really nice for this. It does have a little bit of a chameleon gauge, so you want to look at potentially knitting it more loosely, but the mohair in it helps those stitches hold their shape. So that's an option. If you really want to look at other yarns, there is a worsted weight version, but again, we were trying to stick with something that was more economical. And so our DK weights, we just have a broader selection of DK weights across the board.
Would the terrazzo or the,
Oh,
Green-
terrazzo would be nice.
would they be appropriate with the
Yes.
Tweety? Yeah, okay.
Terrazzo, Tweety, or either of our Tweeties, the hedgehog Tweeties or Tina's Tweeties or felted tweed those would all work really well. Again, but you have to check your, you have to swatch. So I think those would all be really nice. And again, the DK weights, even in the more expensive fibers and the animal fibers, tend to have a good amount of yardage per skein, or have a good price point. Like the terrazzo has a good price point, even though it's not gazillions of yards per skein. Yeah. I think so. This ends, we'll be done with the sweater in June or July. And I think it would not be the worst thing in the world to make it out of soft fun, which would make it kind of sweatshirty because it's a cotton acrylic blend. I think that would be really comfortable and you'd be able to wear it right away, potentially in the summer. I thought about actually doing it alongside of the one I'm doing in soft bun, and I just can't bring myself to knit 2 sweaters right now. Just there's a couple of other things going on in the store right now. I might get lost. All right, so how'd we do? Oh, perfect. It's just 7. There is another Zoom tonight. It's the Monday night Zoom, correct?
Yes.
And then we announced during the Instagram live that we are holding off on Sunday night Zooms for the time being. So our evening Zooms, everybody is welcome to come. I mean, the Project Monday is always at 6 o'clock on Mondays. And then at 7:30, there's an open social Zoom. And that is again on Thursdays at 7. Are we still calling 7 o'clock crochet time?
No, we've already renamed it on the Ravelry page.
Okay.
It's social time.
It's just social time.
Any craft is welcome.
Absolutely. Including and not restricted to coffee drinking.
Not at all.
You just want to hang out and
Mhm.
listen to Ingrid get in trouble.
Hey.
You know who you are. So it was wonderful to have you all with us today. I hope you're encouraged and you're excited about starting a sweater. If you've never knitted a sweater before, we are going to go through this every step of the way together. Do not panic when you look at the pattern. Not panic. It's all going to be fine. Any other questions before we go? All right, I'm going to stop.